Mist clung to the rolling lawns of Hawthorne Hall as dawn crept over the horizon, painting the ancient stone with a pale, reluctant glow. Inside the mansion's vast kitchens, where heat and noise usually reigned, the morning had begun with an unusual tension. Servants moved with sharpened urgency, whispering as though afraid the walls themselves might report their nervous chatter. And at the center of this hum of unease stood Frances Whitcomb, her sleeves rolled, her dark hair rebelliously escaping its cap. At 20, Frances possessed a defiant composure that unsettled those who preferred their servants silent and grateful. She held her chin high, even when scolded, and met every gaze with a steadiness that revealed more courage than was common or welcome in a kitchen maid. That morning, she had intervened when the housekeeper berated a trembling scullery girl, stepping forward with a calmness that felt perilously close to insolence. The reprimand she earned for her trouble still echoed across the work tables. Yet despite the sting of rebuke, Frances refused to shrink. Her father had taught her, before the world unraveled beneath him, that dignity was a possession no one could confiscate. She clung to that lesson now, even as the other servants stole glances at her, some admiring, some fearful. For though her skill with a knife and palette made her indispensable, her sharp tongue and unyielding pride ensured she remained an object of steady gossip. Today, however, all whispers carried an edge of warning. The Duke had returned to Hawthorne Hall the previous evening, and whenever he was in residence, the household braced itself. Alastair Hawthorne, 25 and already burdened by expectations far older than he, carried authority like a blade, cold, gleaming, impossible to ignore. Though handsome in the rigid manner of aristocrats shaped by generations of duty, he was not known for gentleness. His temper was restrained, yes, but only in the way a storm is restrained before it breaks. Frances had never spoken to him directly, though she had heard plenty, that he valued efficiency above warmth, that he despised disobedience, and that he suffered no criticism, however slight. So when he unexpectedly stepped into the kitchen shortly after sunrise, the room fell silent as if a bell had tolled. Mud stained one of his boots from a morning ride, and a thin line of blood traced his forearm where he'd scraped himself on a low branch. His presence tightened every pair of shoulders except Frances's. She had her back to him then, muttering under her breath as she diced onions with swift, steady strokes. The Duke paused, hearing the tail end of her grumbled remark about nobles believing their boots cleaner than their souls. A slow, dangerous quiet settled over the space. Several servants froze, eyes widening. One dropped a ladle with a clatter that echoed like a death knell. But Frances, oblivious, continued working until the housekeeper hissed her name. She turned, knife in hand, and found the Duke standing mere feet away, his expression unreadable but unmistakably sharpened by offense. The tension between them formed instantly, an invisible thread pulled taut. Frances dipped her head but did not lower her gaze, a choice that drew a faint, disbelieving murmur from those watching. The Duke studied her as one might examine an unexpected defect in a polished mirror, not with hatred, but with startled irritation. "Is it common practice," he asked coolly, "for my staff to pass judgment on their betters before breakfast?" His voice was calm, but each word bore the weight of a reprimand that could ruin a future. Frances felt the kitchen hold its breath, yet something stubborn in her refused surrender. She answered that she spoke only to the condition of the world, not to any person in particular. Though her tone betrayed the edge of challenge, she struggled to conceal. Her boldness struck him. Witnesses later whispered that the Duke's lips tightened not in anger, but in something closer to perplexed outrage, as if affronted by her very courage. "I would sooner marry a thunderstorm," he declared sharply, "than a rude cook such as you." Gasps scattered across the kitchen. Frances, cheeks flushed yet eyes unwavering, dipped into a curtsy whose exaggerated grace made plain her opinion of the insult. His jaw clenched, her pulse quickened. The moment ended as abruptly as it had begun. The Duke swept from the room, leaving behind a tremor of shock and fascination. Frances exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of every stare. Yet even as she returned to her chopping board, she sensed the fragile order of Hawthorne Hall shifting. Outside, the sound of carriage wheels announced the early arrival of guests for the impending royal visit, a visit upon which the Duke's standing precariously depended. And Frances, still flushed from their exchange, felt the story's first fault line open beneath her feet. Preparations for the royal visit intensified with each passing hour, and Hawthorne Hall quivered beneath the weight of expectation. The kitchens, already a crucible of heat and pressure, now felt on the verge of combustion. Servants darted between stoves and storerooms with frantic purpose, their faces flushed, their whispers sharp with fear. Should the upcoming banquet fail to please the Queen's notoriously discerning palate, the Hawthorne name, already precarious from recent political missteps, would suffer a humiliation for which it might never fully recover. Frances felt the strain acutely, though she refused to show it. She worked with disciplined precision, folding her private anxieties beneath a veil of composure, as she always had. Still, beneath that practiced calm, something far more fragile throbbed. The confrontation with the Duke earlier that morning had unsettled her more deeply than she wished to admit. Not because he had insulted her, the nobility's contempt rarely penetrated her armor, but because he had looked at her with an attention she did not understand. It had not been simple disdain. It had been scrutiny sharp enough to draw blood. She sensed, with a kind of dread, that their encounter had lodged itself in a place neither of them could easily ignore. As she kneaded dough at a side table, her mind pulsed with questions she refused to entertain. She did not have time for such distractions, not with the kitchen bristling under the watchful eye of the housekeeper and the increasingly impatient head butler. Glancing around, Frances noted the tremor in the scullery girl's hands, the perspiration beading along the baker's brow, the uncharacteristically clipped movements of the footmen receiving crates of costly ingredients. The entire household seemed to vibrate with shared unease. The source of that unease sharpened when Lord Kettering arrived days earlier, allegedly to provide support for the royal preparations, though everyone knew he relished the chance to witness the Hawthorns falter. His sly smiles and soft-footed prowling through the corridors made the servants stiffen and the senior staff bristle. Frances had observed him only from a distance, but even that was enough to recognize the dangerous smugness of a man who enjoyed pulling threads until entire tapestries unraveled. She did not realize how swiftly he would turn his attention toward her. Late that afternoon, as she retrieved herbs from the pantry, Frances heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Lord Kettering surveying her with a curiosity that felt uncomfortably intrusive. She froze, not out of fear, but out of irritation at being cornered by a man who clearly considered servants unworthy of the courtesy afforded to people of rank. After offering a perfunctory greeting, she tried to leave, only for him to reach for the cloth-wrapped bundle tucked at the edge of the counter. "What have we here?" he asked, unwrapping it before she could intervene. The sight of her father's hand-forged cooking knife gleamed beneath the dim lantern light, its worn handle polished through years of use. Frances reached instinctively to reclaim it, but Lord Kettering lifted it out of her reach, studying it with a theatrically raised brow. "A royal kitchen mark," he said, tracing an engraved insignia with a fingertip. "Quite the treasure for a mere maid to possess." His meaning coiled like smoke around her. She felt heat surge beneath her skin, not from guilt, for the knife was rightfully hers, but from the knowledge that this man intended mischief. She explained, steady but strained, that the knife had belonged to her late father, once employed in a royal household. Yet even as she spoke, she saw disbelief bloom in Kettering's eyes, followed by a thin smile that foretold trouble. Word spread quickly, as such poison always does. By the time Frances returned to the main kitchen, conversation stilled and eyes slid away from hers. The housekeeper refused to meet her gaze. The scullery girl, usually eager for comfort, skirted around her as though touching her would invite disaster. The accusation that Frances had stolen royal property had taken root faster than truth could chase it. She worked through the growing tension, refusing to cower. yet she felt the walls closing in around her minute by minute. When the Duke finally appeared in the doorway, face shadowed by a mixture of irritation and confusion, the room fell silent once more. He crossed to her with a controlled stride, stopping just close enough that she felt the weight of his scrutiny. "I am told," he began, voice low, "that you possess an item belonging to the crown." The humiliation of the moment burned through her, but Frances lifted her chin with unwavering resolve. She explained the knife's history, her father's service, the legacy he left her, but even as the words left her mouth, she sensed his doubt. His skepticism stung more sharply than the accusation itself. "You believe him," she said quietly, her voice threaded with hurt she wished she could hide. "You would trust a lord you barely tolerate over a servant whose honesty costs her everything." Her trembling hands betrayed her composure, and she hated herself for it. Yet the Duke did not answer, nor did he accuse her. He simply watched her, the line between suspicion and reluctant curiosity etched across his features. Frances turned away, refusing to let him see the tears that threatened. Instead, she marched to the head butler and declared she would prepare the banquet's centerpiece herself, a risky, defiant move that left the entire kitchen stunned. The Duke remained silent, though something flickered across his expression that might have been shock. As she set to work, commanding the staff with a confidence born from necessity, Alistair lingered in the doorway. He watched her movements with an intensity she felt but did not dare acknowledge. Then, just as the rhythm of the kitchen began to steady, a scream cut through the hall. The Dowager Duchess had collapsed after tasting an early trial dish, one Frances had not prepared. Panic erupted instantly. Servants ran, the housekeeper wailed, and uncertainty rippled through the mansion like a gathering storm. Frances set down her spoon, heart racing. She knew, without being told, that the fate of Hawthorne Hall now rested on her shoulders. The Duke's gaze found hers across the chaos, and for the first time, she saw no disdain there, only the dawning realization of how desperately he needed her. Night settled over Hawthorne Hall with a heaviness that felt almost sentient, as though the mansion itself sensed how precariously its fate now hung. Rain battered the windows in uneven bursts, and the wind howled through the chimneys, stirring the shadows that clung to the long, silent corridors. In the kitchens, normally emptied by this late hour, lamps still burned, casting molten gold across work tables strewn with half-prepared ingredients. Frances stood among them, sleeves damp, hair disheveled, exhaustion tightening her posture. Yet her eyes remained clear, fixed on the task before her with the intensity of a woman determined to carve order out of chaos. The Dowager Duchess's collapse had sent the household spiraling into panic. Physicians had determined the incident resulted from a spoiled ingredient mishandled earlier in the day, absolving Frances entirely, though few thought to offer an apology. Instead, responsibility for salvaging the banquet had been placed squarely upon her shoulders, not through kindness, but through desperation. And Frances embraced the burden with a silent resolve. She knew that if she faltered now, the Duke's name would not survive the humiliation. It was not loyalty that drove her, but a stubborn sense of duty, anchored in the lessons her father had once imparted. When disaster strikes, the one who steps forward defines the future. She worked long after the others had collapsed into restless sleep. Dough rose beneath damp cloths, stocks simmered low, and the faint aroma of caramelized onions mingled with the sharper scent of herbs she crushed between her fingertips. Her movements were rhythmic, purposeful, each action carried out with a practiced grace that belied her fatigue. In the quiet, her father's voice returned to her, gentle reminders about temperature, texture, and intention. Cooking, he used to say, was a dialogue between the heart and the flame. Tonight, Frances felt the truth of that more deeply than ever. She was so absorbed in her work that she did not hear the Duke enter. His boots made soft impressions on the flagstones as he approached, though he stopped several paces behind her, reluctant to disturb the fragile focus she wore like armor. For a long moment, he simply watched, the lamplight caught in the strands of her hair, turning them copper. Her hands moved with surgical precision, her brow furrowed in concentration, her breathing steady despite the storm raging beyond the windows. Alistair had known courage in many forms: political opponents, military officers, stubborn nobles, but none had unsettled him as deeply as the quiet fortitude of the woman before him. The earlier accusations against her still churned in his mind, laced with guilt. He had not condemned her, but he had hesitated, and that hesitation had wounded her more sharply than any public reprimand. His uncertainty now tormented him, revealing cracks in the foundation of pride he had long considered unshakable. "You should rest," he said finally, his voice softer than Frances had ever heard it. She did not turn, but her shoulders tensed. "Rest would only add to tomorrow's troubles, Your Grace." He stepped closer, stopping beside her table. "The burden is too great for one person." "It became so the moment you asked me to defend myself," she replied, her tone level, but carrying an undercurrent of hurt. "And I will not let your household suffer because of a lie left unchallenged." He flinched, just slightly, though he masked it quickly. "I did not accuse you." "No," she said quietly. "You only doubted." The words hung between them, delicate yet devastating. Frances finally looked up at him, and for a moment, neither seemed capable of speech. In her gaze he saw exhaustion, fierceness, and something far more unsettling, a capacity for truth he had spent years avoiding. He cleared his throat, unsettled by how small his title felt in this dim, intimate space. "I wish to understand. Your father, was he truly in the Queen's kitchen?" Frances hesitated, then nodded. "Before misfortune found him, before debt and illness turned us into a family no one wished to remember." Her fingers traced the edge of a mixing bowl with absent tenderness. "He taught me everything I know, and he taught me to stand when standing is the only thing left." Alistair's expression softened, the edges of his composure fraying. "You carry his legacy with remarkable strength." "Strength," she murmured, "is often mistaken for insolence." A faint, rueful smile touched his lips. "Perhaps I mistook many things." He reached forward, not to touch her, but to steady a bowl that teetered precariously at the edge of the table. Their hands brushed, brief as a spark, yet the jolt of contact seemed to reverberate through both of them. Frances withdrew slightly, breath catching, while Alistair held still, as though afraid a single movement might shatter the fragile moment forming between them. "I know you think me arrogant," he said quietly, "and perhaps you are right. But I'm not blind. I see the weight you bear tonight, and I see the courage with which you bear it." Frances searched his face, uncertain whether this gentleness was real or merely a passing mercy. "If you wish to reprimand me," she said, voice trembling with restrained emotion, "do so after the banquet. Tonight, I must save your name." He felt the sting of those words, not for their disrespect, but for their loyalty, the loyalty she offered despite the world's cruelty. He stepped aside, giving her space, though his eyes lingered with reluctant admiration. As dawn threatened the horizon, Frances carried the final dish toward the grand hall. The Duke watched from behind the glass partition, a tension tightening his breath. The banquet unfolded with agonizing slowness, until the Queen tasted the dish and paused, eyes softening with unmistakable recognition. She asked to meet the Creator. Accusations died. Gossip stilled. The Duke's world shifted. And as Frances stepped from the kitchen into the corridor, summoned by royalty, Alistair followed her. No longer from duty, but from something far more dangerous. In the days following the banquet, Hawthorne Hall shifted from breathless triumph to simmering unrest. The Queen's praise, though transformative for the Duke's standing, had not softened society's gaze. Instead, it had sharpened it, turning Frances into the subject of relentless scrutiny. Servants who once whispered only about her sharp tongue now whispered of ambition, impropriety, and the dangerous closeness between a maid and a duke who had defended her before an entire hall of nobles. The aristocracy, clinging desperately to its brittle hierarchy, recoiled at the mere possibility that Frances might occupy more than a servant's shadow. Alastair felt the weight of that disdain immediately. Letters arrived from influential acquaintances, carefully worded yet unmistakably pointed. Several warned him that his household had allowed a servant to overstep, while others implied that his reputation, freshly restored, teetered once more toward ruin. Even his mother, pale but recovered, counseled caution. Her voice trembled with concern rather than cruelty, yet her message pierced him all the same. A future duke must not entangle himself with a woman the world deemed beneath him. Francis, unaware of the extent of the pressure bearing down on him, sensed only that the air around her had grown colder. Footmen who once joked in the early mornings now stepped aside without meeting her eye. The housekeeper, who had long tolerated Francis's spirited nature out of respect for her skill, now regarded her with brittle wariness. Even the scullery girl, who used to cling to Francis's sleeve like a skittish shadow, kept her distance. Only the kitchen fire treated her, as it always had, warm, steady, indifferent to rank. She worked quietly, preserving her dignity through silence, though her heart grew heavier by the hour. She did not seek Alastair, nor did she attempt to interpret the fleeting glances he cast her way when their paths crossed. Those glances, taught with unspoken words, terrified her more than open hostility would have. She feared misunderstanding them. Worse, she feared understanding them too well. The breaking point came 3 mornings after the banquet. Frances found herself standing before the head butler with a folded note clutched between her fingers. Her decision had crystallized overnight, shaped by equal parts self-preservation and loyalty. She requested reassignment to a remote Hawthorne estate, insisting it would ease tensions and restore harmony. The butler, though surprised, did not argue. Her reputation, however unjustly tarnished, was complicating matters the household could no longer ignore. After delivering the request, she returned to her small quarters and began packing with trembling care. She folded her apron, wrapped her father's knife in fresh linen, and tied the ribbon around her recipe ledger with fingers that refused to remain steady. She placed her farewell note on the small table, addressed to the Duke, though she doubted she possessed the courage to let him read it. It contained no declarations, only gratitude, gentle, understated, heartbreakingly final. She had just tied the last string around her bundle when the corridor outside erupted with hurried footsteps. The door swung open, and Alastair stood framed within it, rain streaking his coat, breath uneven as though he had searched every corner of the mansion to find her. Francis froze, heart lurching painfully. "Why are you leaving?" he demanded, his voice rawer than she had ever heard it. She swallowed, lifting her chin in a futile attempt at composure. "Because my presence has become a burden to your household. And to you. You presume too much," he said, though his tone suggested her words struck closer than she knew. "I presume nothing," she replied softly. "The world has made its opinion quite clear. If I remain, it is you who will suffer the consequences." Alastair stepped further into the room, the door closing behind him with a soft click. His eyes were fixed on hers, fierce with something she could not decipher. "I have withstood Parliament. I have withstood scandal. Do you truly imagine I cannot withstand gossip?" "It is not gossip," she whispered. "It is cruelty directed at you because of me." A silence stretched between them, charged with all the words they had not yet spoken. Francis could feel the storm outside pressing against the windows, mirroring the turmoil in her chest. She forced herself to look away, but he moved closer, refusing to let the conversation fracture. "Francis," he said, voice low and trembling with sincerity, "I spoke once in arrogance that I would never marry a rude cook like you." He paused, as though steadying himself on the precipice of truth. "But every moment since has revealed my folly. I find myself thinking of your courage, your wit, your relentless devotion to those who do not deserve it. I cannot imagine my days or nights without the thought of you." Her breath caught, but she shook her head, tears brightening her lashes. "You cannot say such things. Not when the world will punish you for them." He reached for her hand, closing his fingers around hers with determined gentleness. A title without honor is ash, but a life without you would be emptiness. The sincerity in his voice shattered the last of her resistance. She bowed her head, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "You do not know what you ask," she whispered. "Yes," he said, "I do." He led her into the great hall, where the household had gathered to hear the final decisions for the upcoming month. Rumors evaporated into stunned silence as the Duke stood before them, Francis's hand still in his. "I intend to marry her," he announced, every syllable ringing with resolve. Gasps rippled through the servants. Shock stiffened the nobles. Yet Alistair remained unmovable, his posture a declaration in itself. Francis trembled beside him, but her heart swelled with an unfamiliar, overwhelming hope. Their wedding followed weeks later, quiet, elegant, luminous in its simplicity. Morning light filtered through the chapel windows, turning the white roses at the altar into pearls of living light. Francis walked toward Alistair with steady steps, carrying not the shame society had thrust upon her, but the strength she had claimed for herself. And when the vows were spoken, when the world's barriers crumbled beneath the weight of their truth, the narrator's words might well have been written across the moment itself. Love, in its most honest form, reshapes the world not with thunder, but with the steady, unwavering courage of two hearts choosing each other despite all odds.